Welcome to the Social Exchange Podcast. Today's guest is Kevin Franciotti. Kevin is a board member of Psychedelics and Recovery Outreach and Services, or PROS, which is a research initiative from the organization Project New Day. Project New Day is a nonprofit that helps people overcome addiction through the responsible and legal use of psychedelics. Kevin's work is particularly interesting to me because a large part of his efforts are allocated toward bridging a gap between 12-step programs like AA and that of psychedelic-assisted recovery. A lot of people have resistance to linking those two efforts, and may even see them as wholly incompatible, but Kevin makes a good case for the contrary. If you've read my book, Outgrowing Addiction, then you know that I largely oppose AA's presence, or 12-step presence in the recovery world. Kevin does a good job of steel-manning my point of view in this interview, and then branching from there to make a solid case for actually wanting to preserve some of the wisdom that 12 steps may have to offer. For his part, Kevin struggled for years with addiction to alcohol and opioids, as well as depression. He dropped out of college, he was arrested, went to rehab, and then he was introduced to the 12-step approach, which he wanted nothing to do with. And it was after finding benefit in the use of psychedelics to alter his perspective about drugs and their involvement in his life that he became involved in this Project New Day branch-off called PROS, where he aims to help people currently involved in 12-step programs incorporate psychedelics in a measured way into the recovery experience. Today, he and I talk about his background, his experience with addiction, and his move away from it, and we discuss his involvement with Project New Day and psychedelic research in general. Enjoy episode number 57 with Kevin Franciotti. I'm here with Kevin Franciotti. Kevin, thanks so much for being on.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me to be on, Zach. It's great.
I've talked to a lot of people now about in the psychedelic recovery community, and you'll probably correct my language there, but my most recent participant on the podcast was a fellow named Rick Barnett, who just went out to California to participate in their post-grad program for psychologists to be able to prescribe and lead people down the road of recovery from addiction through psychedelics. And so I've been really fascinated by this. Of course, I understand the research more recently that's come out of Johns Hopkins and other universities that have funded research. And so I'm really interested in what your basis is for being so boosterish about psychedelics and what your role is in this realm. So maybe you could start people off by just explaining a little bit about your background and how you became aware of psychedelics, and then talk about a few of your current projects.
Sure. I'll try to avoid that becoming basically the entirety of this podcast by answering that question.
Yeah.
But I'm glad that I'm glad I'm following in Rick's footsteps here. It's a good kind of segue to expand on this a little bit. I've gotten to meet and getting to know Rick a little bit better more recently. So he seems like a really fascinating guy and really passionate about this topic and the future of psychedelic healing in kind of the professional, medical, and psychiatric space. So I come at things obviously from a more like community-oriented background. I'm not a physician. I'm not a trained clinical psychologist or anything like that. I'm a formerly like aspiring academic, basically. And depending on how I envision my future, I could return to that. But starting in like high school, essentially, I discovered psychedelics as part of like my rebellious experimental phase of adolescence, and tuning on to cannabis as being something that I resisted trying while all my friends started to try, because I was brought up in the DARE era and came from a family who didn't see any socially acceptable form of drug use outside of alcohol. So I had, exposure to alcohol like before I was a teenager, just at family parties, like taking sips of my dad's Corona and hating it. But by the time I came to experimenting with my first drugs, it was just natural to start with alcohol, raiding my parents' liquor closet and things like that. So about a year after my friends first started smoking cannabis, I decided to give it a try. And I remember after like my first night smoking, which I didn't get high for the first 3 or 4 times that I tried. Whatever I was doing wrong, it just didn't get me high. But the morning after I first smoked, I remember waking up and feeling like I was going to hell, because I crossed a line that I can never uncross. And that just comes from like this sort of conservative upbringing. So that's kind of the concept that I went into this whole thing. But after like a year of forming a relationship more or less with cannabis and hanging out with friends, I recognized this kind of different mindset that cannabis gave me than alcohol did. And it gave me all the recreational components, but then it also gave this like stimulation of intellectual interests. And I found myself like really digging into, why is this thing illegal? Why is this so demonized? Why did I never get an accurate education about this? And instead it's like, you don't ever get to do this, or you go to jail, or you become a drug addict. Through that, I discovered Erowid, I discovered MAPS, I discovered Normal, and I discovered this whole movement around drug policy reform, essentially, and like cognitive liberty arguments for humans having a right to experiment with consciousness and the tools to alter consciousness, namely drugs. So I kind of embarked on a curiosity that lasted through college and took me to experimenting with psychedelics, experimenting with other drugs, and wanting to dedicate like the rest of my life to exploring not only these states, but then how can I become part of this movement that is bringing psychedelic medicine into mainstream psychology.
I feel like a lot of people have gone through that. I'm not sure how old you are. I'm early mid 30s.
Yep, same.
I went through the DARE program, and I also have a fascination with, I think, what you call cognitive liberty, in that people should have much more expansive rights to be able to alter their consciousness or do whatever they want, think as freely as they want to, without somebody stepping on that right. But I feel like a lot of people have gone through that, and perhaps not so many people as curious or as set on examining this or fighting for it. I don't know if that's how you would put it, as you are. Is there anything else that really tripped your interest more specifically? Is it temperamental maybe, or something that clicked for you?
It's hard to pinpoint that, honestly. It seemed like it just kind of happened. I mean, maybe it was just the way my personality makeup was, and my general curiosity about life. Came across people like Alan Watts, and obviously like, you know, in the art scene, like Jack Kerouac, and I went through that whole phase of reading the Beats and On the Road and things like that. But what really struck to me more from that line of inquiry was the meditation piece. And the first time I ever tried meditating was towards the end of high school. And I've like stuck with that basically till this day. I keep an active meditation practice. So it's hard to like say what really led me in that direction, rather than just saying intuition. Because I remember the first time I took mushrooms, it was in the same recreational vein that I was introduced to alcohol and cannabis through. It was like partying with my friends in an isolated, secluded part of town where nobody would find us and catch us, and we'd be left alone. But the difference, at least for me, was that when I started tripping, the biggest effect that I felt, like the biggest drive I felt, was to call up my parents and apologize for being such a bad kid. And fortunately, I had inflated pupils and weird out of nowhere things that I was going to tell them, but I didn't like create that. That was the eye on mushrooms. Something struck me from my experience with cannabis and mushrooms, that there was something more going on to these things than I had ever been exposed to from like the DARE education, that drugs aren't all bad and not everybody does them as a bad person. And I didn't know anything about the history of them at that point. That's what like led me to that curiosity. But yeah, it really just happened spontaneously.
That's interesting. That's interesting that you had that sort of revelation, and you made a distinction in your mind very clearly between what you were told about drugs and their experiences and the effects they'll have on you, and the experiences you were feeling. And I imagine, as you mentioned, wanting to, your intuition at the time was to call your parents and tell them sorry for how horrible you've been. So if you're having these experiences on drugs and also psychedelics, and you find them profound, yet the world's telling you that they're bad, how did you begin reconciling that?
Well, I can't say that I reconciled that responsibly. I approached that more combatively, and decided to like make myself an ambassador for this part of culture and society that most people either don't understand, or what they do understand, they seek to demonize and marginalize. And now, like, granted, I have the fortune of and privilege of coming from a suburban white family, 2-parent household, both full-time employees, making good money and being able to support and provide for myself and my 2 siblings. So, I had the benefit of privilege and resources that maybe a lot of people growing up that get exposed to drugs don't. So my desire to take upon this topic as like the focus of my rebellious adolescent energy didn't come about in a super positive direction. I got arrested several times. I was really obstinate and willful and arrogant. And I think the danger that I found was the fact that I didn't really approach my experimentation cautiously, thoughtfully, and with the right kinds of guides, mentors, and teachers. I didn't have any. The best that I could find was in textbooks and readings about the research from the 50s and 60s. And so I had no personal individualized attention to help me steer towards the right direction. It was very self-guided and self-directed. And that proved incredibly problematic by the time I got to college, because I was opening up these doors of my unconscious, basically, that led to bouts of depression and desire to isolate and fear of the future and anxiety that a lot of people that age go through. But instead of relying on any kind of serious positive therapeutic support, I instead relied on substances to provide me the relief that I was seeking.
What do you mean by open the doors of consciousness?
Exposed me to parts of my personality that I had no knowledge of being able to access. I didn't know that apart from dreams, I could have intense experiences where I'm communicating with a memory of my childhood, or not even really be able to understand some of the themes that would come up in a trip. I wouldn't understand certain imagery that I'm seeing, or why I'm having intense anxiety, and is this what they mean by a bad trip? All of that stuff was very new to me, and I couldn't come out of it in the days following and talk to somebody about that and help me process and integrate it.
I mean, you had an over-reliance on turning back to psychedelics to try to reproduce those experiences again.
Yeah, and not necessarily just psychedelics to kind of bring me back up, because I needed to come down, and I needed to have more visceral body type of, I don't know if I can explain this well, but basically I'm trying to get to how my experimental misuse and lack of assistance with integrating led me down a path of opiate use and experimentation, because after a while the negative after effects continued to increase, while the short-term positive effects would last less and less, and my life wasn't improving overall in an 8-year period. And eventually I discovered opiates at a very low point in that life trajectory. As a year before I was supposed to graduate from college, I started using opiates and eventually became dependent on them after a year. So that took my entire life trajectory on a whole different level. And I never really knew what the concept of addiction was on a personal level. I'd obviously heard of addiction from my schooling and just society in general, but I never could personify that as something that I was capable of becoming.
When you were in the throes of, or when you were amid your worst or most destructive relationship with heroin, did you feel addicted then? Or did you still have trouble personifying that narrative that you heard and applying it to yourself?
Yeah, it's a good question, because I don't really think that I could accept that I ticked all the right boxes and had the personal understanding that I was an addict, as defined by not just the DSM, not just the 12-step ideology, but that based on my personal experience, there would be days that I woke up with full intention of not driving an hour to get heroin, coming back and spending the entire day nodding out and doing it all over again, and then doing it anyway. I remember drives where I like was telling myself, turn around, you don't have to do this. And so like until that happened, I didn't really have this full appreciation of recognizing like the addiction within myself. And that didn't happen really until almost a year after I went to rehab. I was doing opiates from 2009 to 2010. It took me a year of doing opiates to realize that I had a physical dependence to them. And if I didn't take them after a couple, 2 or 3 days, I would have trouble sleeping. I had all the classic signs of withdrawal, but I didn't know, like, I knew what withdrawal was. I knew it was a predictable scientific phenomenon, but I couldn't piece it together in my mind that what I was experiencing was withdrawal. And I had like almost a year-long period where by the end of it, I kind of decided upon myself to wean my dependency down. And I did that through finding a friend who had a take-home methadone prescription, who sold me a couple of his pills. And again, this like points to the arrogance and naivety that I was going through. I was able to wean my physiological tolerance down, but I never really took the logical leap of not returning to opiate use. And after just a couple of weeks, my experiment failed. I transitioned to IV heroin use. And then only a couple of weeks into that, I got arrested and went to rehab. So following rehab, I relapsed, but by going to rehab, I was introduced to the whole 12-step ideology. I was introduced to the concept of powerlessness and needing to rely on a power greater than myself to restore me to sanity and tread the path towards a spiritual awakening that could free me from the obsessive and compulsive desire to use. And I didn't take to any of that stuff. I didn't find it to be applicable to me. I didn't really view it to make sense to others, really. I saw that it met with success, but I didn't respond to that message after being in this inpatient place for a month and having, criminal charges waiting for me if I didn't respond to this message and turn my life around. So in 2010, I get out of rehab, and within a matter of weeks, I relapse. And at this point, I'm a college dropout. I moved back in with my parents, and I have like all of my hopes and ambitions for my future just completely in the back of my mind. It's like I can't even picture what it would be like to get back on the path that I thought I was heading in.
So at that point, you served out whatever sentence or whatever you had to do to reconcile the criminal aspect of things, and you had completed or were still attending maybe 12 steps and a rehab program, and then you were with.
Yeah, I hadn't been ordered to it. I was like advised to do that by my attorney, and he said it would take a long time to get the court system to transfer my case to the treatment court system, which would then mandate me to treatment. But it would be helpful if I could show that I had been doing it, or at least trying to do it all along. So that's what I had outpatient that he was telling me to go to. I wasn't really doing any of it. And so by the time he was able to get my case transferred to treatment court, now we're talking like end of June 2011. And at that point, I was worse off than I was before I went to rehab. And that's where the period of my life that I described earlier as like now fully identifying like, wow, I'm an addict and I'm addicted to heroin and I don't know how to stop. So the intervention that was like had on me there was a far more like holistic, compassionate intervention by my mom. And she just asked me straight up, like, do you need help? And I said, yes. And I wanted to do this drug that I had heard about years ago to get me off of heroin, which would be Ibogaine. So I told my lawyer about that. And in July of 2011, I went to Mexico to get Ibogaine treatment for opiate detox and enrolled in the MAPS observational trial and was mandated at that point to long-term like aftercare in a year-long program through the drug treatment court in order to get rid of my criminal charges. Shortly after I was finished with my Ibogaine treatment and I was living in South Florida in a halfway house, I decided to just start like approaching my life as if this is not compulsory. This is like something that now I want to do in addition to kind of stuff that I have to do to help build my life back.
You were describing a point in your life when you sort of realized that you had gotten yourself into this cycle and you've identified with this thing that you've never identified with before, i.e. addiction. I can imagine that sitting there jobless in your parents' home was, as you said, was probably a worse experience. It made you feel worse off than you were and less capable of constructing something for yourself than you felt before you actually went to rehab. And so you're saying at this point when you're feeling a little bit more constructive and like you have agency, this is after you had done this experimental Ibogaine treatment?
Yeah. And like part of my story and where it brings me today with how I view recovery was initially very much influenced by the 12-step approach, by this dominant disease model, powerlessness, reliance on a higher power that I resisted in rehab, that over the course of the next year, like a large part of the reason I think why I maintained the level of use and habitual cycle and eventual like full-blown recognition of addiction in my life was that the only available path to recovery I thought existed, let alone that I was qualified and eligible for, was the 12-step path. So I think part of that is definitely a key to why this like phase of my life lasted so long. And had I maybe gone another route or viewed alternative approaches, things might have gone differently. But it's hard to talk about this period of my life without recognizing that I only saw recovery through a 12-step lens, because that's what was presented to me in rehab. And that was even through the treatment court system, like the way that my attorney described what I would have to do sounded very much like part of this model of living in a halfway house, going to meetings, getting drug tests. And like none of that stuff appealed to me. But at first it was because, well, I wanted to keep getting high. And obviously if I'm getting drug tested and living in a sober living environment, I can't do that. So that was another key component to wanting to resist. Like I can't even smoke weed. I can't even drink casually. I get that I need to stop doing heroin, but do I really need to stop doing everything? And since I had to contend with that for this like 10-month period in late 2010 to summer 2011, I had no interest in any of it. So the change that came was recognizing, okay, resigning myself to the fact that if I need to like put my signature on this recovery that's being offered to me, I have to take on all of it. The change, I guess, in my mindset was that this isn't the worst thing that could be happening in my life right now. And let's look at the evidence of the past year, 2 years. Like clearly something needed to change. And if this is the change, this is the way of changing that is presented, it can't be that bad. But it's very much like this sense of resignation. It wasn't so inspirational. I felt the sense of agency, but agency was such a black and white decision. And fortunately, like I decided to make the decision in the other direction, but it just kind of sucks that I thought though it was just a dichotomous choice that I had.
Thank you for letting me interrupt the conversation for just a minute. I want to remind you that this show is sponsored by you, and we're very grateful for it. If you'd like the show and you would like to contribute, then consider becoming a member of our team at Patreon. Go to patreon.com/thesocialexchange to make a donation as little as $2 and receive early access to all regularly scheduled shows as well as bonus content, and we give you more the more that you contribute. Again, to contribute, go to patreon.com/thesocialexchange. Oh yeah, and if you contribute, we'll thank you in these segments, as I'm about to do. Major thanks to our current Patreon subscribers. Well, first, thanks of course to my family members who already have to put up with me on a regular basis, but who also support the show. Thanks to Linda, Tom, and Molly Rhodes, and to Sue and Pete Matthew. And thank you to Dean Lemire, Christy McPherson, Nuncio De Martino, Susan Lennon, James Stacks, Chris L., Leon Nahufahu, Sherry Chandler, Dee Dee Stout, Christopher Hanlon, Henri Pompel, Carter Vermont, Rick Barnett, Ann Earl, Inigo, John Holt, Layla, Mary Kay Villaverde, Michelle, Nancy, Sean, Regina Ferguson, Timmy Tucker, Christian, Kathleen Cochran, Marjorie Israel, Trevor, Susan, and Diane Taylor. Again, to become a patron, go to patreon.com/The Social Exchange. Thanks so much. And now back to our interview with Kevin Franciotti. Right. So I could imagine it's easy not to feel such a sense of agency when you have, like you say, kind of a false dichotomy. The circumstances didn't change for you, but clearly your perception of the circumstances changed. You had just a more expansive view of what these things that were happening in your life meant on a grand scale. You gave it temporal context, and you gave it just overall physical context in your life. Do you attribute that to psychedelics?
I'm a very reflective person, clearly, and I spend an exhaustive amount of time wondering about the past, and trying to make sense of it all in my life, and probably too much for anybody in general, let alone whatever. But that question is something that I constantly ask myself, and the reason I mentioned participating in the MAPS trial was now I had this psychology or anthropology investigator asking me this question every month for a year while I was going through the protocol. So, and this is kind of brings up this sense of agency again. So because of my background as this kind of aspiring professional academic psychonaut, one of the worst things that bothered me was not being able to see a path back to that world, as now living in a halfway house in my early to mid 20s, not having graduated from college. All this stuff was stacked against me, and now I'm basically sentenced to this year-long treatment court program. The one guiding light that seemed more of an internally motivated thing was my enrollment as a participant in this trial. And that gave me the internal motivation to want to provide solid data to a psychedelic study. So I knew that if I maintained abstinence and voluntarily chose the hair test sample to corroborate that instead of the urine test sample, those kinds of things would strengthen the data that I was giving to this study. So every month, the investigator sent me some questionnaires, and then he called me for a phone interview where he gave the ASI, and then he, at the very end of this conversation, would ask the qualitative question of, how much do you credit your Ibogaine treatment to your success at this point in your recovery? And my answer fluctuated throughout that year. The first few months, it was 100%. My life would not be anywhere near where it is if it weren't for Ibogaine. And then 6 months later, when I was fully drinking the Kool-Aid of 12-step, I was no, I really think it's probably more meetings and the sober support network that I've built around here, and the external accountability that is now weighing on me, that doesn't feel like so much of a outside pressure. It just feels like this is my life. And after a year of answering this question, then I just kind of settled on this 50-50, that without Ibogaine, I don't think I would have entered into this compulsory recovery with an open mind. And if it weren't for the swallowing the 12-step Kool-Aid and really finding success in it, I don't think I would have been able to sustain that recovery.
Is that how you still feel about it?
My life, without spending too much time talking about my recovery journey, and because I think this is really the important piece of my recovery path and my story, is this phase. But, eventually I relapsed a couple of years ago, and I think it comes from this same mindset that I had at that age with I don't really, which is why right now I'm joking about calling it the 12-step Kool-Aid, because I still drink the 12-step Kool-Aid. But now, when I drink it, it's it kind of tastes a little bit bitter, and maybe this wasn't the best batch. I don't, there's tons of things I don't like about it. And then there are tons of things that I've resigned myself to accept as one of like the most unique kinds of organizations society has overall, let alone in the ability of it to provide a place for recovery from people. So, I went through a phase after I was able to successfully return to college and complete, started to build a path towards maybe coming back to an academic pursuit of psychedelics, entering graduate school, getting into a relationship and moving to a different city, that eventually I became more and more disillusioned by the 12-step ideology and less interested in it, and starting to resent it. And, that's a common kind of theme on a person's path to relapse in like the 12-step world. And I very much like followed in that path, though it seemed a little bit, everybody's path seems a little bit different and unique to them. But I went through basically all of the kinds of same things, same themes that people do. And it took until just over 2 years ago for me to come out of that relapse.
As you were speaking, I was realizing someone recently was trying to explain 12 steps to me, and they were trying to argue in favor of it, I guess you would say, like a rebuke to my distaste for 12 steps. And it was explained to me that, he was saying it was kind of like how you go to see your family on Thanksgiving. I don't know if you can relate to this or not, but you might have a few family members you don't like so much, and you kind of know that even all among your family members that you love and enjoy, there are going to be some shitty conversations, things that you want to avoid. And that's how he feels about 12 steps. Like, it's part of the warp and woof of life for him, and he accepts that and enjoys that. And he still has to know that he has to use his mind to navigate the difficulties of it as well. It's sort of, I don't know if that's exactly how you'd couch it, but I mean, that sounds like what you're saying. You lived through it. It was just sort of a part of your life. Difficult to tell just how much 12-step ideology and participation led you to where you are in terms of success, but you still are able to take from the pieces that, preserve the pieces of that program that worked for you, and able to discard anything that you felt didn't.
I like that metaphor a lot. And what comes up for me with that is actually kind of taking a little different view on it, in that, growing up, I know what Thanksgiving dinner looks like with my family. I know what Christmas looks like. I know what my like traditional cultural upbringing looks like. But if I were to, having grown up not a Jewish person or Muslim person, if suddenly I decided to fast and explore Ramadan, or if I were going to like participate in a Jewish family's holiday season, it would be whatever idea, whatever preconceived notions I had about what it's like to recognize Ramadan and fast for a month, and recognize like the Hebrew holy calendar, having no upbringing through it. And if I were to jump into that now, I would discover a bunch of things that I love about it and totally get, based on like the universal overlaps that many spiritual practices have. And then there would be a whole bunch of things that I absolutely hate and make no sense to me whatsoever. But if I didn't have like a fully immersive experience in it, I wouldn't be able to appreciate any of it. So I think where people get hung up on 12-step is like the way the Hazelden Foundation and the Minnesota model of addiction treatment, like the way dominant medical treatment absorbed the 12-step ideology and tried to translate it into a traditional medical intervention, just completely lost a whole bunch of nuance that just ignored the fact that the 12-step recovery program is not a professional, operationalized, formalized medical intervention. You don't go to med school so that you can prescribe AA to somebody. It's crazy. And that's why I can appreciate so much of the harm reduction world. That's why I can appreciate so much of writers like Maya Salovitz and the model put forth by Stanton Peele, and even like criticisms of AA and NA by Lance Dowds, and those folks. I can view both of those things simultaneously in my mind and understand why there's a problem here and why we need to remove, the 12-step approach needs to be what it always was meant to be, is a peer-driven, community organized structure of mutual aid. It is not designed to take people mandated through the criminal justice system and take people, who don't want it, to force them there and let whatever old timers who are tried and true 12-step people take care of these folks, because that's just not appropriate and very harmful, as we've seen in a number of ways.
This maybe is a nice tie-in to what you're up to now. Why don't you take it away?
I guess the simplest way to point this out is by focusing on my story, as is the easiest for me to do. Around the time where I was becoming disillusioned with 12 steps and wanting to discover a place for psychedelics to have in my recovery, I came across a group that was meeting in New York City, and they were basically doing that. They were having a meeting where people could come and share experiences about having psychedelic integrated recovery. And it took me a while to get to one of these meetings. I showed up and it was just all very familiar. Here is exactly what I imagined, a recovery movement that carved out a recognized role for psychedelics for people that didn't automatically assume they were relapsing and they're about to spiral out of control and their life was going to be like that of a relapsed addict, as a 12-step response would be. That group, dissolved for not reasons related to that, but more organizational reasons. But I decided at that point to approach the person who co-founded it and kind of rebrand and reawaken the idea. And we spent the next year or so emulating what he initially founded for that group. And we attracted some friends who would come in and join us. And we all had this very intentional idea of coming together to have that kind of sharing. It was loosely organized. We just had to meet up, and some of us came from different recovery pathways, and we tried to figure out where do we want to settle into one philosophy or conceptualization over another. And we also struggled with just maintaining regular consistency among the people who would come to join us. So it didn't really gather much momentum for another year or so. But I think the key discoveries for me was realizing that this is not a crazy idea. This is not a totally outside the box thing that only a couple of people would relate to. And in spring of 2017, after I had already started kind of my relapse path, I went to the MAPS conference and was able to hold a community gathering. They had a community organizing track of the conference, and I proposed to them to have a Psychedelics and Recovery meeting. And lo and behold, dozens of people, 50 to 60 people came into this meeting. And suddenly I realized that, wow, there really is something here. And it's going to solve the problem that we're having in New York. And by shifting things online, now I can gather people from across the country and theoretically the world who can find this message and join us on an online meeting. And we then kind of decided to adopt a lot of the philosophies of 12-step organizations. Many of the members, if not all, that were attracted to this psychedelics in recovery idea also came from worlds in recovery that had tons of exposure to 12-step. Some either hated it, some either loved it and were still active in it. Some were kind of like me and could see the pros and cons and maybe had a tenuous participation and ongoing membership in it. But it made, the more folks had conversations about this, the more it made sense to recognize how the 12 steps are kind of a built-in integration model for psychedelic experiences, and particularly for psychedelic experiences by those that are in recovery. So through like periods of organizing and having conversation, we decided to mold ourselves around that model. And we kind of maintained like that for the next couple of years. I relapsed and distanced myself from the group because I wanted to get high and was ashamed of being a part of it. And it survived during that period up until I came back 2 years ago. And then like really there hasn't been a whole lot of monumental change to the structure of it. We created a website, we were growing an email list and things like that. And then through a kind of separate yet like similar growing movement among non-12-step models of recovery, other people were doing similar things. And it got to a point where the overlap emerged, and this foundation was created in the Santa Cruz area among some psychedelic researchers, some philanthropists, and some people that worked with various community models of healing. And the one they decided to form around, they called themselves the Project New Day Foundation. And they decided to focus their first year of work on psychedelic recovery outreach and services to support these communities that were doing this work. And I was identified as somebody that was kind of a community leader in this space. So they invited me to sit on the advisory board. And that work started at the beginning of the year, pre-COVID and pre-closures, mass closures of meeting spaces. So we were doing some work to help with these communities that are organizing and kind of help them provide resources and ideas and support. And then because of the model of the meeting that I've been involved in, having been used to online format for so long, when all of the in-person, like 12-step meetings, smart recovery meetings, all of these in-person meetings were shut down and everybody shifted to online, we saw a huge demand in the membership and meeting attendance. So things have taken like an exponentially increased trajectory at this point that we were prepared for. So it's been an like incredible past couple of months to work with that. And it seems like this kind of recovery has a really promising future.
You said that a few years ago you relapsed and then sort of got back in order a couple years ago. What does that mean to you that you relapsed, first of all?
It means to me that I still fit the criteria of a person in recovery from a severe substance use disorder that met with, whatever the DSM code is, like in sustained recovery or sustained remission is, I think, the way one psychologist told me that his diagnosis was to bill for insurance, that I'm, severe opiate use disorder in remission. And that it's not strange that I relapsed. I can point to themes that contributed to it. I can point to things I could have done differently, but for whatever reason, I have learned that a relationship with substances is sometimes the only thing that I can turn to provide the answers to the questions or struggles that I'm going through in my life. And that is not necessarily a safe path for me.
So you had a bad weekend and you turned to substances, but then on Monday you figured, well, Jesus, that was stupid. Would you be calling that a relapse, or is it more that you started building an essence around the relationship with drugs?
Yeah, so it's a good question, and I think one that kind of helps to describe a nuance for the reason why there's such a diverse approach to understanding what addiction is and how to recover from it, because one camp might tell you one thing and another camp would tell you something else. So what you just asked, like if I was the reason, and that this could be part of the reason why I didn't want to show my face around a 12-step circle, because if I told them that I had a drink after a bad weekend, they would have all jumped on me and called it a relapse, made me reset my day count, and now I'd have to resign from any kind of service positions I would have. So there's this like punitive component to 12-step that I think turns a lot of people away who struggle with responding to that message. So for me, I don't actually really view So I returned to having a relationship with substances, let's call it that, in around March of 2016, after spending about a year thinking about whether this would be a safe, responsible thing for me to do, and how could I avoid returning to areas that could lead to far worse outcomes. But it brought me back to this place of really not having much experience, relying on someone else for proper integration. So between March of 2016 and April of 2018, this phase of my life involved a lot of similar themes to my first kind of phase as a teenager. And so, I followed kind of a natural progression of more frequent use of different things. And I avoided some of the stuff that I knew that I at least suspected would cause a more immediate downfall, which would be opiates. But something I didn't plan for was to really be in kind of unguided territory at a time when my father suddenly passed away at 64 from a heart attack while on vacation with my mom. So not part of my plan at all, not part of anybody's in my family's plan. So that happened in August of 2017. And, at that point, I was already in some sketchy spaces. I had already started taking opiates again with kratom, and then later with a supplement called tianeptine. That's an opiate like drug. And at the point where my dad died, I had basically been holding back the floodgates of heroin. And, I had in the weeks before that, or maybe even right after it, I had already been trying to dial my old dealer's number to see if it was still on, or to see if he would pick up or recognize my voice. And then when my father passed away, I hadn't been to a meeting in over a year. Some of the friendships of people I had in recovery had become more distant. And I was seeing a therapist for stress related to graduate school and stuff like that. My girlfriend and I at the time were in a really rough patch. And so all of the conditions were met for me to say, fuck it, and call up my dealer one night and meet him. And so that's kind of what I call the full blown relapse phase of this path this part of my life.
Got it. And that's really interesting to know that you had forethought about how you might integrate drugs back into your life, or whether it would be a good idea. It was less haphazard than perhaps when you were younger. But then again, as you were just mentioning, there were just pieces of your life that were so unexpected that sort of hit you all at once. You didn't really want to center this around you so much. You wanted to center it around the work that you're doing. But of course, I've found you interesting now. Just the last thing here. How did you pull yourself out of that space?
With all of the prior knowledge that I had, and the real is the experiential memory of having gone through something that I didn't feel could be getting out of, that I could eventually return to that somehow. But for many months, I wasn't even thinking about that, because I was, you mentioned the term caught in the throes of your addiction. And it very much was that. Again, there was days where I would, out of against my will, go to use, and I was getting money from places that was really problematic. And, so my life was spiraling and I couldn't see a way out. And I had been unable to make the discomfort or uncomfortable leap to going back to a 12-step meeting, holding up the white flag and saying, this experiment of mine failed. I was too ashamed to face those kinds of people. And eventually I decided to kind of do something similar to what I did when I tried to wean myself off of my dependence in 2010, just before I switched to heroin and went to rehab. I tried to get a prescription for buprenorphine from a clinic. And here I faced what I had long heard about, which was the ridiculous hurdles and things that people need to jump through in order to get basic evidence proven treatment. I had been going to see this therapist at a mental health clinic, and I knew they had a chemical dependency program. So I asked to make an appointment with the psychiatrist and the intake director and all of that. I was living a chaotic, unpredictable life. So just to make that first appointment said a lot about my willingness at the time. So I showed up to this appointment. I did all the intake. I said, okay, can I get my prescription now? And he said, oh, no. First, you have to come to a few groups and you have to meet with me individually, in addition to having just done this intake. And I'm like, okay. And my motivation lasted just long enough for me to go to a group and then get the prescription for Suboxone and then get it filled. But by the time I actually had the medicine, I lost interest in doing it. And I found another source of money and was able to maintain my heroin use for another month. And, it's just insane to imagine that that's that brief window of opportunity could so easily be missed by bullshit, and I'm not going to say that maybe had I gone through all that, I would have been cured and everything would have been better. But just the fact that there was a week-long period where I was fully motivated to pursue recovery and interrupt this lifestyle, and that chance was missed for another month. Who knows what could have happened differently. But I'm sitting with this 2-week supply of Suboxone in my closet. And just one day when the right conditions returned, where I ran out of money, it had been a couple of days, I was going through withdrawal, and my ex-girlfriend decided to go, or didn't decide, actually she had a death in the family, and she left to go to the funeral for her grandmother. And I wanted to use that as an opportunity to spend the weekend kicking, basically. So at 5 a.m, I just took, without thinking, one of the strips and induced withdrawal, and began another process of getting clean.
Really interesting. I mean, you mentioned that you didn't want to show your face in groups that you had been associated with in the past, yet you are now, you're on the advisory board of Project New Day, etc. How did you reintegrate that space in your life?
I had nowhere else to go, I would, and there was really no justifiable reason not to return to those places. And I reached out to people that I personally knew, that I knew wouldn't judge me, and that I knew that I could trust. So I had a friend that I said, hey man, I'm 3 days clean. Can you bring me to a meeting? And he said, I'm on my way, that kind of guy. And I went to a meeting and I listened to the guy who was speaking. And, I called him a few days, it's very kind of traditional stuff that people who come back to meetings after a relapse go to if they're going to tread the right path and try to reintegrate into recovery.
And how are you received by that group upon your return?
With open arms and no judgment and love.
Completely antithetical to your expectations.
Exactly.
Tell me about some of the work that you do for Project New Day. I let us off the track a little bit, but you were explaining that you were recognized as a person who's done some incredible work in this field of outreach and associating psychedelics with people's journey to, build a balanced life. What kind of work do you do, and to what extent are you involved?
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And, as much as I want to separate my personal story from this work, I think it helps derive a number of really important lessons and questions that lots of people have. And I think the biggest emphasis to put on kind of putting a button in my story is it's just that, it's my story. There are people that I've now met through doing this work in supporting communities and recovery lifestyle that incorporates psychedelics. Is my story is my story, and these folks have their own stories, and many of them lack a story of relapse. Some of them have a story of not being able to enter recovery until they had a psychedelic experience, or being 20, 30 years in recovery And after a long period of time in sustained, like, positive, healthy living, they remember suddenly, or they read Michael Pollan's book, and now they're thinking again, like, wait, I never used psychedelics in the same way that I drank, or I never would have imagined that there's somewhat accessible ways to find a local guide that I could pay to sit with me and help me integrate a psychedelic journey. Or lo and behold, there's a community of people in my neighborhood that does ayahuasca drinking ceremonies. So some of these things are becoming more accessible to the average person, and people want to explore it, but have all these same kind of hesitancies about it. And I think that the key takeaways are both that A, people are doing this, and B, it can be done with the right intention, with providing the right resources that can only really facilitate an added piece of helping people maintain their recovery lifestyle. And it can bring improvements to people that struggle in ongoing recovery with mental health or with trauma or grief, just universal kinds of emotions that, regardless of whether you're in recovery or not, people go through, and now there's an outlet for them. So the work that we're doing is with this foundation is to support all types of recovery communities incorporating psychedelics. And part of that work involves, like, supporting attendance at conferences to explain this. It's to choose a few of the current organizations that may have the best, like, infrastructure to help now boost that up a little bit and fill some of the holes that they may have not been able to fill yet, organizationally or what have you. And now that, like, COVID has kind of put everything on a complete transition, it's kind of not known where the directions we're going to be going in the future are. But we've now, like, fully carved out a place within both the recovery community and the psychedelic community where there's a rich overlap and ways that the conversation now, like, deserves a place in the broader, like, theme of both of those worlds.
Part of the work that you do, and I don't know if this is your brainchild or something that you sort of fell into, but I've noticed that, as you've just explained, you're marrying the concepts of self-awareness through psychedelics with that sort of self-awareness track through standard or maybe traditional recovery. You're an example of why that can work, although I'm sure you wouldn't suggest that people go through exactly the same channels of discovering that, the benefits of all of that as you went through obviously some hardships. So how do you help people understand how to bridge those concepts together in a way that, preserves all of the good of your experience?
Yeah, and it's a great question. And I think the benefit that we have in this somewhat new area of work is that a lot of it is not new. I spend a lot of time trying to not reinvent the wheel and look to older models that have met with their own successes and gone through periods of growing pains and learning hard lessons. And so I think the simplest way to answer that question is by learning from the lessons of the harm reduction philosophy. And a lot of the harm reduction philosophy revolves around meeting people where they're at, recognizing behaviors that people are doing, and then trying to not accommodate, but facilitate ways to minimize the risk of they're doing and maximize the potential for positive growth. So overall, like, it just so happens that because of my story and how I have this ongoing relationship with 12-step that has, like, waxed and waned over the years, it's kind of still the one that I'm the most familiar with. So that's the one that I spend most of my personal time with. But overall, in the, like, foundations work, I think by recognizing that various recovery communities and communities in general, there are people doing these things, we now have kind of an obligation as people in this field to minimize their risk and maximize their potential for growth.
Mm. Can you give an example of how that might work, just so that we could get a more clear picture, a more practical idea of how something like this would work? I mean, if I was somebody in some sort of traditional recovery, or I guess my own idea of what recovery is right now, and I was tinkering with the idea of psychedelics or something broader, how would I be introduced to this program, or how I could help integrate it into my life?
For me, the best way to answer that question is through like the familiarity I have with the 12-step world. So, one of the mutual aid groups that the foundation works to support is this organization, Psychedelics and Recovery. And it's taken upon itself to model after the 12-step groups, and it tries to follow that approach. So for the folks that like come to that group through a traditional 12-step model, there's a couple of like intellectual leaps that have to be made, but they've put together a list of guiding principles essentially for those folks to maybe be exposed to for the first time. And that could be something as simple as recognizing that if you're going to pursue a psychedelic experience, you essentially have to have some level of participation in an illegal market. And whether you're going to seek out a guide or a community that comes up with their own source for this stuff, you're talking Schedule I substances for the vast majority of them. So many of these people, like, they have maybe never had experience with knowing whether the LSD they buy is pure or not. Or maybe it's been so long since they've like bought anything on the illegal drug market, they don't like know how to not get arrested. So, it could be something as simple as providing people the education of knowing your rights, knowing some of the ways to test for impure substances, and even basic suggestions as like trying a small amount before you decide to go on your journey, so you can get a sense of how you're going to respond to the drug itself, or the medicine, or whatever term you want to use for it.
In that realm, I know that it's probably counter to what you're able to do to give any sort of a case study, because the nature of being anonymous sort of forbids that. But is there anything like that you could offer, a success story from somebody who's participated in this sort of new way of thinking about things?
It would, I mean, so the groups that have meetings, like every meeting, there's a person sharing about their positive journey. There's people that discover a new insight on a particular aspect of their recovery, that enhances something that they've been stuck on for many years. So yeah, it's tough to like tease out very, very specific examples on how people have benefited, but I guess you wouldn't see a community pop up of hundreds, if not thousands of people, without them being there for a reason. So clearly there's like merit to be had, and it's not part of like the work that the foundation wants to do on a somewhat perhaps longer term basis is to develop some of these outcomes. And you can put together a survey. So we are having discussions like that, but for now it's very, very anecdotal. And we've had some of the direct observational work that's been done by the academics on this advisory board have been to observe the meetings themselves. So not just the like Psychedelics and Recovery group, but there's a group out in the San Francisco Bay Area that's part of the San Francisco Psychedelic Society. That's a Psychedelics and Recovery meetup. So we've had our Project New Day Foundation board members who are trained in observational and qualitative research sit in on these meetings and be able to describe them in an academic context and offer their analysis on what is to be benefited from them and what they notice. So I don't know if that's a great answer, but we're it's not impossible to develop like outcome surveys, but we're just not quite there yet.
Right. No, that's a fair answer. And then it's an honest one too. I mean, you're not trying to over explain or let this entire way of thinking, you're not trying to say that it solves more than it could possibly solve, just that it would make sense to integrate them. and that a lot of people have found success in it. When people have seen success, is it similar to like the kind of open-mindedness that you found previously when you mentioned that, you had returned to the same experience, you returned to the same set of circumstances in your youth when you were using a lot of drugs and they were destructive, that you had remembered being in, sort of trouble with the law, needing to do this thing that felt like a binary, not, a false choice, but you were able to realize it as not the worst thing that could be happening to you. You're able to see beyond the idea that it was detrimental. And so perhaps you had this way of elevating your experience to notice those things. Is it that kind of a similar benefit, a different mindset that people are getting when they're integrating these things?
Yeah, I mean, to not hopefully get too philosophical here, but the human experience is so personal and seemingly alone that it's hard to, like, the way that mutual aid groups have their success is through individual storytelling and identification with one another. So even if someone from a completely different background and life story that I have can tease out themes that are very similar, like emotional reactions to things, and just, you can kind of just understand that I'm in the room with people that think like me, and we may not have had the same paths, but we share many of the same commonalities. And I remember when I first, was in this room in 2017 at the MAPS conference with 60 odd people, I felt very much that, oh, wow, I'm in a room of people that have gone through a very similar kind of internal journey among themselves in recognizing that psychedelics in recovery is a possible lifestyle and not bad. And part of your question speaks to the absurdity of what addiction treatment and recovery is, where it's at, in that one of the most dominant, long-lasting successes of addiction recovery are these mutual aid groups, and that we have a couple of evidence-based treatments for certain types of substances and through medication or what have you. It's just this whole of medical treatment that has never really flourished in the way that others have. So I'm trying to avoid going all over the place with this answer, because it was a somewhat complicated question.
Yeah.
But in that MAPS conference meeting and in other kinds of meetings, a lot of people discover this message that psychedelic use in recovery is possible as a refreshing vindication of something that they've long suspected, or it's a relief that I've been doing these things and now I have other people like me who understand it that I can talk to about it. Or it's people who are like, oh yeah, I mean, I've been in a traditional AA group for 20, 30 years and I do acid 4 times a year and it's no big deal. So there's people like that just have long gotten it. So right. we've been there's a diversity in perspectives and life paths that is just kind of unpredictable.
Right. Okay. So that at a more basic level, there are people who there's sort of an emperor's new clothes dilemma going on, where everyone has to sort of sit in the meetings, and there could be just more than one person who's using psychedelics but can't really say anything about it. And in that sense, you're giving them an opportunity to share in a space that upholds what they're used to in terms of their recovery process, but also allows them to share that sort of space in their lives.
Yeah, exactly.
You've sort of touched on this, but how would you describe I'm a skeptic in a sense of just everything. but I think in a healthy way. I'm also very open-minded. And one of the things that drew me to your work is that I'm very, very open-minded about psychedelics and how they might be integrated and help people. I do recognize a lot of what people have said when they've overcome addictions or had new amazing life experiences on psychedelics as, the most lucid ways that people have described it to me is that it's not as incredibly profound as you might hear in some stories, although some people do explain it that way. But, it's more like they finally got to a place where they like woke up, I guess. And they're like realizing, wow, okay, wait, I was really narrowed in on this one or two set of things, and I wasn't recognizing the rest of my life, all of the dimensions of my life that make it so interesting and tie together, and that I have control over. I felt that way when I feel like I just sort of sidestepped my own really destructive involvement with heroin and drugs and the things that are associated with it. And I kind of got to a point without anything else that you'd call, some people will call what happened to me spontaneous or natural recovery. I remember feeling this sensation where I had that realization. And I truly believe that there is an element of psychedelics and what could go into psychedelics and the camaraderie around trying to understand what's going on with them that allows people to have this experience in a much more expedited fashion. So, sorry, that was a long-winded way of saying I'm skeptical of everything, including this, with the understanding that I'm very much open-minded about it. But how would you talk to somebody who is maybe more skeptical and maybe you would say cynical about this entire enterprise? Have you seen this happen? Have you been able to convince anybody that, to think a little bit deeper about it than perhaps they are? Or, anyway, kind of an open-ended question, but leave it to you.
No, it's a great question to ask because it really depends on what world the person skeptical is coming at it from. So you could have your folks that are tried and true, like guzzle at the Kool-Aid of 12-step, just being like, no, it's a cut and dry relapse. Like you're not in abstinence-based recovery if you've carved out a place for psychedelics. Just sorry. You could qualify, whatever. I don't have to get too deep into the nuances there.
That's probably that's probably most of the skeptics. That I wasn't even thinking about it because that's not my orientation, but that's probably most pushback you get.
Yeah, well, yeah, like I said, it depends on the camp of folks that you have asking. So, I have friends not just like acquaintances that I know from meetings, but I have friends from meetings that work like a 12-step program in their recovery. And, I've talked to them about this, and they have even checked out a couple of the meetings, and they asked me tons of questions about like, trying to answer their skepticism. And most of them end up getting to a point where they're like, okay, like I can see it, but it's just not for me. And I kind of think some of the folks in that group are trying to justify their relapses. And I go, okay, I'm not convincing you of anything. I'm not trying to convince you of anything. And then what I was thinking initially from your question is from a more like objective kind of science driven place, and is like, well, is it really the psychedelics that are benefiting these people so much? Or is it just because psychedelics happens to be the modality that they approach to like get at whatever they're looking for? So like if back in 2011, if I didn't actually go to Mexico and take Ibogaine, would I have entered recovery at that point in my life? Like, who's to say? The point is that I did, and I'm sure that things could have worked differently if maybe the modality that I sought was to get on methadone, or to just go cold turkey and jump right into a 12-step meeting or therapy or whatever. But one of the most kind of fascinating areas to be a part of, and the reason I'm so excited to like have a prominent place in the conversation about bringing psychedelic medicine research into the dominant academic circles and medical circles, is to now be a part of creating these research questions, to operationalize some of the clinical trials that are going to help answer these questions, because realistically, that's the only way that they really can be answered or even asked in the right ways, because otherwise it's just anecdotal. But what I am inspired by is it's a return to the history of early research with psychedelics. I was just reading last night about the Maryland Psychiatric Center research on like chronic psychiatric conditions, and the first and most and largest clinical trial of psychedelics to date, probably until the not too distant future when some of the ongoing studies right now get published. But in 1963, back when the Maryland Psychiatric Center was still called the Spring Grove Center, and they started the Spring Grove psychedelic experiments with LSD, they treated 69 participants with alcoholism with LSD. And the outcomes from that trial like serve as the kind of verifiable justification that there is merit to having interventions with psychedelics like LSD on people with alcohol use disorder. And now there are half a dozen clinical trials with psychedelics used on different populations of substance use disorders that are starting to be published and are starting to recognize it. Now they all have their like specific research questions, and some of them have like really hard to generalize findings. Like I know, for example, the NYU trial enrolls participants to look at whether psilocybin assisted therapy combined, I believe, with motivational interviewing reduces the use severity of people with alcohol use disorder over time. And one of the inclusion criteria is that participants are able to abstain from alcohol for 30 days before enrolling in the study. And I mean, you can imagine the outcomes among a participant pool of people that are able to first achieve that income criteria as positioning that type of person much better for long-term success than somebody who's not able to abstain for 30 days before enrolling.
Yeah. If I'm somebody who wants to seek the kind of services and camaraderie and, dare I say, fellowship that you're able to help people find, how do I locate, what do you even call it? How do I gain membership into what you're practicing here?
Yeah, so the groups that I'm aware of, like the San Francisco Psychedelic Society, obviously before COVID, you would have had to have been in San Francisco. I'm not to attend one of their meetings. I'm not sure if they like accept people outside of their locality, but I know their meetings they used to try to cap a certain number of people that need to register for it. I don't know about them now, but if you search for San Francisco Psychedelic Society and the group leader is Danielle Negrin, you could find out more about that group. The Psychedelics and Recovery group has a website called psychedelicsandrecovery.org, and there are set up a few resources for people to read more about it. There's some personal testimonials. And then there's a contact page to request to receive the information about upcoming meetings. I believe they have 4 weekly meetings, so there's plenty of opportunity for people to join. They follow like a similar 12-step suggested requirement. I know that's a little oxymoronic, but that people like have an interest in a desire to end whatever addictive substance use or behavior that they exhibit, and an interest in incorporating psychedelics into that recovery. But apart from that, it's free and it's weekly, and it's on a video chat platform.
Is there any contradiction between what you're trying to do with psychedelics and tenets in 12-step literature that you've had to square in order to make what you're doing work?
No, that's a good question. I'm glad you remembered to ask, because I described kind of how long my journey has been over the years, and how I initially discovered a group like this that existed in 2016 and maybe even earlier, that people that identify with that message and come from 12-step organizations that have their own like fleshed out guidelines and criteria and program, the people that would go to a psychedelics meeting would probably have many of the same questions. And in the years since, you're talking like 5+ years at this point, conversations have led to the development of like unique guidelines to the psychedelics program that answers those questions. And I think, again, going back to like avoiding the reinventing the wheel thing is, you know, there are dozens of 12-step organizations that have popped up since the formation of AA, and many of them are not strictly related to substances. So, you know, you have, for example, a Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous, Overeaters Anonymous, and Gamblers Anonymous now, like clearly, especially among like Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous or Overeaters, they're not programs that require abstinence from eating or abstinence from sex. So that would be ridiculous. So instead, to try to kind of expand the model of how the 12-step concept can be applied to overeating, they establish more of kind of harm reduction guidelines and what kinds of behaviors are what they might call bottom line behaviors and stuff that you would want to avoid. You see this a lot in the Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous literature. And so there's a whole spectrum and a nuance of ways that people can maintain responsible, healthy behaviors while avoiding the ones that are more resembling a self-destructive or addictive pattern. So it's not a big stretch to imagine applying that to psychedelics. And you know, another kind of natural question of that I sometimes get, and more recently lately, is do you find people discovering these groups that are actually seeking recovery from psychedelics and that they use psychedelics habitually or addictively? And I think it's a complicated discussion, and that's why I think it's still at very early stages. Like, is daily cannabis use, should that be a bottom line behavior? Is microdosing something that is not exactly what you have in mind here when describing these? And I think the benefit of being new is that, and not reinventing the wheel, is that we have well-intentioned and thoughtful people to come together and discuss exactly what kind of guidelines they want to develop from this. And it's not just one person describing one thing that may have worked for them but wouldn't work for someone else.
It sounds like you carry a sort of universal and foundational harm reduction premise with whatever you do in terms of meeting people where they are. And you do have some knowledge that you bring to bear. And you also recognize that people thrive in some sort of a structure. So you're trying to preserve that part of things. The question about how to do this precisely is up in the air, and exactly to what extent, which of these, is it the psychedelics that are helping? Is it the attitude that a person brings? Is it the format? To what extent each of those things are providing the success is a question worth studying. Not quite sure, but there are reasons to believe that in everything that you're doing, it's going to be doing more good than it's going to be doing harm in a person's life. Fair?
Yeah, and I think, those are the kinds of answers and guidelines that I think when that kind of approach is taken to setting things up, you allow a certain level of flexibility, and none of your criteria is too rigid that it would potentially cut off those folks just because of fearing the potential risks that could come by not doing that. Now, like, there are certain things, for example, that, like, say, I know one of the guiding principles in the Psychedelics and Recovery group is, again, to recognize that just because you've gone through the internal negotiation with appreciating the role for psychedelics in a personal program of recovery doesn't mean that society doesn't still recognize it as a Schedule I drug, and doesn't mean that they'll be forgiving if, for example, a minor happened to be in around you and suddenly you have a child services case open against you for endangering the well-being of a child. So, like, there's still a grounding in reality and an accepting of what could get people into trouble outside of this. But I think a good example that I find ironic in looking at the way 12-step organizations have responded to like drug replacement therapy or medication assisted therapy for opiate use disorder, and you have methadone and buprenorphine and naltrexone and some others. The difference between what Alcoholics Anonymous says about their position on those medications is that
Zach here. Kevin cut out right in the middle of that statement. I think what he was trying to say was that the position that Alcoholics Anonymous takes on drug substitution is something like, just as it is wrong to enable or support, as they say, any alcoholic to become re-addicted to any drug, they would say it's equally wrong to deprive anyone of medication which can alleviate or control any disabling physical or emotional problems. So they would be then in support of medication-assisted treatment. Okay, back to Kevin.
Narcotics Anonymous doesn't. They actually say that if you're on any of those medications, then it's up to the groups to decide how they want to allow that person to participate. Would they be eligible to chair a meeting or even speak at a meeting as like the lead, or as they go so far as to possibly allowing some groups to say, if you're on Suboxone, like, we appreciate you coming here, and once you get off that medication, you're allowed to share and all that stuff. But for now, we ask that you just listen, and if you want to talk to somebody, please do it before and after the meeting. Mm-hmm. That's crazy, So those are the kinds of lessons that these newer groups with psychedelics have the benefit of looking at to see, wow, that policy doesn't make any sense at all, and here's all the ways that it created potential destruction and alienation of people for what? For the sake of the integrity of being an abstinence-based program. And so it's a trade-off, and what do we want to position ourselves as being able to provide while reducing the amount of crazy policies like that.
Look, I used to believe up until very recently that it must be the case that to have some success in this arena that you'd have to completely do away with things like 12 steps. I didn't see a bridge to 12 steps into what I would think of as a constructive way forward for people at large at a population level. Just without having all of the ills that I find in those programs. You are very convincing, and you and others have been very convincing, that in the 21st century, people have, with a little flex in the system, the ability to reconcile 12 steps with the things that might come up for a person in their lives and the things that might come up for a group that might be contradictory to traditions, much in the way that a lot of religion does. And so anyway, your cogent perspective here is appreciated. You mentioned knowing our mutual friend, Rick Barnett, who I jokingly call him my intellectual arch nemesis, because he's this, he's always kind of been upset with me for disparaging 12 steps. And he had this idea that I just wasn't looking into it enough. And I was trying to explain to him, no, man, there's no way. I completely understand what goes into 12 steps. I get what people get out of it. I get that it helps some people, and some people are wedded to it for the rest of their lives, and maybe that's the best for them. But I don't see that it could possibly, 12 steps could be possibly used in a way that anybody could participate and know that they're going to get some good out of it. And so he and I have been wrestling with this for a while. So it's interesting that his sort of entrance into this world of psychedelics is coming at the same time that I'm talking to you about it. And I think that his and my perspectives on these things are both shifting in a way. And I recognize the ability now to dislodge, even if it's gradually, what could be some of the things about 12 steps and any other kind of framework of recovery that I've seen in the past that could hurt people, and, allow this to be done in a really thoughtful way, and in a way that doesn't, it just loses dogma, I guess you'd just say. The dogma is what I have the most problem with, when something is obviously needing to be changed and can't possibly be changed because, well, those are our first principles. This is just the way it is. I see this as a great way forward and an interesting way forward. And I hear you as somebody saying that, people's recovery, the way that most people are doing it in the programs they've signed on to, what are you going to do? Just tell those people that they have to ditch everything that they've ever learned? So anyway, it's a nice melding of those two worlds. And I appreciate being able to speak with you about it.
I appreciate you saying all that because I coming up in the world initially of like drug reform advocacy work as like a college student and a psychedelic research enthusiast, and then later like a recovering person, has given me a really unique perspective. And at times it comes out more rebelliously and like defensively and arrogantly. But I think the benefit that I've been able to maintain is seeing like the merits of all of those worlds. And it's funny, I joke about this, that I spend more time among like the 12-step fellowships and the people that respond to that perspective by defending harm reduction. And then in the harm reduction circles, I have to spend more time with those folks defending 12-step. And then like the psychedelic space, I have to spend time defending both like the harm reduction and 12-step movement. So it's so funny how fractionated people are with their individual perspectives and what they think works. But, I think what might be really helpful for people is to like separate. Let's use Alcoholics Anonymous as an example, since it's the first of these 12-step organizations. I think if people can separate the organization component of what Alcoholics Anonymous is compared to the like spiritual based program of recovery that it is for the individual recovering alcoholic, and look at it from a historical perspective, it's one of the most unique organizations that we've had developed in the 20th century, if not, like, honestly, I don't want to get too crazy, but like throughout human history. It's probably the closest thing to a successful organization that comes close to resembling an anarchist movement. And it's lasted since the mid-30s under that model of this bottom-up, peer-driven, membership-based organization that has figured out a way to govern itself without having a leader ever. And people get like Bill Wilson confused as the leader of it, at least in the beginning, but he was never the leader. He was the co-founder. And, I was in a Psychedelics and Recovery meeting the other night, and one of the members that I heard share was remembering like an interview with a famous author. It's not Arthur Miller, but it was an equally like prominent intellectual who was asked, what is, in your generation, what is the worst thing that has happened and what is the best thing that has happened? And the worst thing he answered with was the Holocaust. And the best thing he answered with was the founding of Alcoholics Anonymous. And that's from, purely a historical perspective. So I think if people can learn to explore and possibly appreciate like the historical role of the founding of Alcoholics Anonymous just on a societal level, and appreciate its success in its organizational model, it can help like loosen up people's resistance to it. And that's why, for me, my work with Project New Day and supporting these psychedelics and recovery movements, it seems like modeling the organizational aspects of these groups on the organizational like precepts of the 12-step groups. It creates an excellent model on how to organize a fellowship like that. And they've found that one step further, that the 12 steps program as an individualized approach to recovery is like a great integration model for people looking for relief through psychedelics.
Very well said. For people who want to search more about the work that you're doing, or learn more about you or Project New Day, or Psychedelics and Recovery, You may have given a few of those links, but care to share or plug any of those resources for people on the back end here?
Yeah, I know Ali Fiducia has done a number of interviews about Project New Day and the Psychedelics Recovery Initiative. Alexander Leckman at Filter Magazine did an interview with me. There's the Psychedelic Liberty Summit that was held at the end of April, and it was supposed to be, an in-person event in San Francisco, but they shifted online, and there was a panel about this work of psychedelics and recovery communities that a couple of the Project New Day advisory board members were on, and it hasn't been released yet, the recording of it, but if folks look into the Psychedelic Liberty Summit, the program where Todd Youngs, Brian Anderson, Matt Johnson were on, and I believe one or two others, that the video of that will be available soon.
All right, well, I've had you on the line for about 2 hours now. Somehow it still feels like I'm cutting it short, but hopefully we'll be able to collaborate on something real soon, and I'd love to keep in touch.
Thanks so much, Zach. Yeah, I'd be happy to come on when there's more to say.